Let's open up with a prayer about this story of Rebekah and Jacob lying in order to carry forward God's blessing. Holy God, our rock and our redeemer, may you silence in us any voice but your own. May all of the meditations of our hearts and minds be acceptable to you in your holy name. Amen. There's two big picture contexts that we need to understand if we're going to get a handle on this story of Rebekah and Isaac and Jacob and Esau. The first is that God's blessings in the world are regularly carried forward, are regularly manifest and realized by means of the underdog, and therefore they are regularly in peril. This is true in the Old Testament in particular, but really throughout the Bible. God's blessings for the world are regularly carried forward through the underdog and therefore regularly in peril. We can see this begin with Abraham's call. So God tells Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you the patriarch. I'm going to make Sarah the matriarch. And your descendants are going to be more than the stars in the sky. And through that great nation, I'm going to bless the world. So that's God's blessing, coming into the world, ready to be released. And then immediately God sends Abraham to a foreign land. And so he has to work all this out in a place that he's not familiar with, and there are enemies around him. Immediately Sarah is captured by a foreign king. Billy talked about this part of the story last Sunday. Taken into the king's harem, and suddenly, immediately, this blessing for the world is imperiled. Well, they work that out. I'm going to talk about the peril, not how things get worked out for this. So they work that out. Then we have to wait forever. No child is born to Sarah and Abraham until Sarah is 90 years old and Abraham is 100. And so for a very long time, it seems like the promise just isn't going to happen. And then finally, miraculously, Sarah conceives at 90 years old and gives birth to Isaac. Isaac from our story today. Well, not long after that, as we heard last week, Abraham decides that God is telling him to sacrifice Isaac. So this son who's supposed to carry forward this great blessing is now on an altar tied up, and literally Abraham has his knife in the air, this dramatic climactic moment in the Bible, and then the angel appears and says, wait, don't do it. It was just a test. And so again, it works out. Isaac grows up, marries Rebekah. It's said that Rebekah was unable to bear children until she was older. Finally, through a miracle, she bears children. When she conceives these twin boys from our story today, Jacob and Esau. And she cries out to God because the twins are fighting in her womb. And it's so painful to her that she literally cries out to God and says, if this is how my pregnancy is going to be, just kill me now. That's a paraphrase, but that's basically what she says. And then God speaks to Rebekah. And this is a big moment. When God speaks to Mary, the mother of Jesus, here God is speaking to a woman in the Bible, Rebekah. And God says, listen, these twins are going to be sons who will be patriarchs of two different nations that will always be at war with each other. And that's why they're wrestling now. So he's like, God says, deal with it, basically. So she finally gives birth to these twins, and just like they said, they're always fighting with each other. Critically, when God gives that blessing, God also says, and the older son will serve the younger. And of course, this is a society based on primogeniture, so that as Jody said in his children's sermon, the inheritance goes to the oldest son. The oldest son carries forward the family name, gets most of the inheritance. The younger brothers are supposed to serve the older. God is saying, we're going to flip that script. We're going to reverse that. And Esau is going to serve Jacob. We heard some of that story in the reading in the children's sermon. I'm just going to jump ahead to follow this idea of imperiled blessing, and then we'll come back to our story. After this, Jacob has to flee his home because his brother Esau wants to kill him for what he did. And so he flees to a foreign land. He becomes an indentured servant to a guy named Laban, who tricks him into being a servant for twice as long as he was supposed to be. Jacob finally engineers his way out, manipulates his way out of that situation, and then his former master chases after him. So now he's being chased by his former master toward his homicidal brother. And again, the blessing is in peril. They work all that out. Again, Jacob comes to the promised land. He becomes the father of 12 sons through 4 different women, and they become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Guess who is selected to carry forward the blessing of these 12 sons? The 11th born, not the firstborn, but Joseph, the 11th born, is told by God, your older brothers are going to serve you. Older brothers don't like that much, so they sell him into slavery into Egypt. He rises through the ranks, and he becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt. His brothers eventually, in a famine, have to go to Egypt and get help from him, and they all end up living there. So now this whole nation, this whole family that's supposed to bless the world is in Egypt, and in a couple generations, they become slaves in Egypt. God liberates them from slavery. They are fleeing Egypt while Pharaoh is bearing down upon them with Pharaoh's army. They get through the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is destroyed. They go to Mount Sinai, and then they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, finally making it to the promised land where they are again surrounded by enemies on every side. That's how God's blessing functions in the world. People who are underdogs, who are never, by a social norm, should not be the ones carrying forward this blessing by what we think, and yet God chooses the underdog to manifest that, could be an underdog, to manifest that blessing, and it's always in peril. Okay, so that's one context of this story. The second is just to note the social locations of the characters in this story. So Rebekah is a woman in a very patriarchal society. She has no value in this society. She is owned. She's the property of her husband, and her only value is in her ability to get married and bear children. And yet this Rebekah is the one carrying God's word that what needs to happen next, against what everybody expects. And then, of course, Jacob is the second-born son in a society based on primogeniture. So he's going to have to flip the script too. That's the context. The problem many people have when they hear this story is, why does it have to be based on a lie? Why does it have to be based on such an elaborate deception? Why does God's blessing for the world need to be funneled through a lie? Where Rebekah and Jacob lie to blind old Isaac, to convince him to trick him to bless Jacob instead of the son he wants to bless, who is Esau. Why does it have to work that way? That's not how God's supposed to work, through lying. There's not a really good answer for that. I mean, we can talk about how lying depends on the person who's doing it and the power that's involved. And so one lie might not be the same as another lie. So if a CEO of a corporation is lying about a janitor, that's going to do a lot of harm to that janitor, probably. If the janitor is sitting around the break room lying about the CEO, that's probably not going to do a lot of harm. So people with more power, when they lie, can do a lot more harm than people with less. And we have to, just acknowledge that that's the case. So that could be part of what we're looking at here as we keep in mind the social location of the characters. When I say by any means necessary, who do you think of? Malcolm X, right. Malcolm X in the late 60s said that African Americans should work towards equality by any means necessary. And that got the attention of the white people in power who had been violent toward the black people for hundreds of years, and Martin Luther King Jr. was on the scene very effectively leading nonviolent social resistance. But Malcolm X comes along and says, by any means necessary, and white people interpret that, perhaps correctly, to mean that violence should also be on the table for black people. If white people can do violence toward black people should be able to do violence toward white people. However, it's not that unusual a phrase, by any means necessary. And there was another person, a contemporary of Malcolm X, who also used that phrase. His name was Jean-Paul Sartre, and he was writing about the same time that Malcolm X was speaking. And Sartre was an existentialist French philosopher, and he wrote a play called Dirty Hands. And in Dirty Hands, there's a quote that makes me think a lot about this story of Rebekah and Jacob. In the story Dirty Hands, the character says, and I wasn't able to get the whole plot of the play, but this quote says, "I did not invent lying. Lies were created by a society divided by class. We all inherited lies when we were born." So there's more to the quote, but let me stop there. Class, hierarchy, patriarchy, primogeniture, it's all a kind of a lie that says that some people have more value than other people, that some people are worth more and should have more power than other people simply by who they are and by their birth. So I did not invent lies. Lies were created by a society divided by class. We all inherited lies when we were born. It is not by refusing to lie that we abolish lying. It is by eradicating class by any means necessary. And so as we hear this story of a woman in a patriarchal society and a younger son in a society based on primogeniture, we might think about the lies that are already imposed upon them in the story that tell them they are less valuable than others in the story. So just hold on to all that for a minute, and I'll tell you where I want to land with this story, how I want to bring it into our lives today. Are there any Rebekahs in your life? Are there any people in your life who don't seem like they're playing by the rules that you think they should be playing by? Is there anybody in your life who you think everybody's agreed to how we're supposed to interact, and it doesn't seem like they're playing by those rules at all? Are there any Rebekahs in your life? I imagine we might all have some or have known some, people who are in our families, people who we work with, or maybe just people we have a chance encounter with, and you're expecting things to go a certain way, like Isaac was expecting things to go a certain way, and this person's not playing by the same rules, and you find it frustrating. Maybe that you perceive them as being confrontational. Maybe you perceive them as being aggressive. Maybe you perceive them as being angry. Maybe you think that they're lying, and you think that should not be on the table as a way to interact in this situation. Are there any Rebekahs in your life? I imagine we all have some Rebekahs or have known some Rebekahs in our life who don't play by the same rules that we thought everybody had agreed upon. And I'd like to suggest 5 ways, very briefly, that we can have a more productive interaction with the Rebekahs when we meet them. First, what's the social location? That original context, the second context that we looked at. What's the social location here? And I want to say first that social location doesn't explain everything at all. It's very complicated, as we'll see in a minute. But it's worth knowing. Am I, in this situation, in this interaction, a man interacting with a woman? Am I a white person interacting with a person of color? Am I a wealthy person interacting with a poorer person? Or vice versa in all these situations? Am I a cisgendered person, so the gender identity that I own now is what I was assigned at birth, and am I interacting with a queer person who has not had that luxury? All of these social locations. Am I an able-bodied person interacting with a disabled person, and vice versa? What are the social locations in this relationship? Now, I say that it's not simple, and it's not, because you can be a black woman manager who has a subordinate under you at work who is a white, disabled, queer man. Okay, and so it's not simple, but we are just as foolish to think that social location does not matter as to think that it solves everything. So what's the social location? Secondly, what experiences has this person had that I may know nothing about? In other words, this is that old saying, everybody's carrying a burden that we know nothing about. Everybody's traveling a path that we know nothing about. Is this person, this is where compassion comes into this interaction. Is this person have a sick, chronically ill child at home? Is this person going through a financial crisis? You don't know it. They're putting on a mask. Is this person struggling with mental illness or chronic pain, something that they're able to mask, but you wouldn't know it? Is this person what we would call neuroatypical? And so there's a way that they interact in the world, somewhere on the Asperger's autism spectrum, and it's not the way we expect people to act. What experiences has this person had that we know nothing about? Third, is this about me? And this is critical. This is where humility comes in as well. Is this about me? And it might be. You might be acting like a jerk. It might be all about you, okay? We don't, who knows what the situation is. It might be about you. It also might not be about you. This might be a situation where this person has had to be on a different footing throughout their life, have had to struggle throughout their life for everything that they deserve, and you're just the next person to step in front of them. And so, yes, it might not be about you. And can we put our ego and our pride aside long enough to acknowledge that? Fourth, and these are not in any order. We do these, kind of evaluate these all at the same time. Am I safe in this interaction? Or am I in danger? And this is not really about physical danger. This is not I guess it could get into that. This is just about, does this person have the power to harm me in the way they're acting? Could they lie about me in a way that could really damage my reputation? Do they have some kind of power that I have to decide, am I willing to stay engaged? Do I need to defend myself and stay engaged? Do I need to step out of the relationship for a while? But am I safe or am I in danger? This is not a sermon about, being a doormat or throwing yourself on every cross that you see. This is a sermon about productively engaging people who don't seem to be playing by the same rules, and we don't always want to stay in that situation if we don't feel safe. And then the last point, the last thing to consider is God's blessing trying to break into the world through this interaction? Is God's imperiled blessing that regularly comes into the world through underdogs, is regularly in peril, that's what's happening here? And do I need to notice it? Can I put compassion forward and pride aside and notice what might actually be happening? Because we know that that's how it works. God's blessings are always coming into the world by means of the underdog, and they're always in peril. Our choice when we end up in an interaction with a Rebekah is, will I be another hurdle for God's blessing in this situation? Will I again put God's blessing in peril for whatever reason? Or can I take a step back with compassion and humility and allow enough space for God's blessing to break into the world and to flourish? Amen.